Welcome to the Your Vote 2018 Congressional District 3 debate, presented by Arizona Public Media, KJZZ, and the Arizona Daily Star. Tonight's moderator, Lorraine Rivera.
Good evening. We're going to be spending the next hour with the 2018 candidates for Arizona's Congressional District 3, Democratic incumbent Raul Grijalva and Republican challenger Nicolas Pierson. Mr. Grijalva, Mr. Pierson, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Also here in the studio are Arizona Public Media's Nancy Montoya, and from our debate partners, Joe Ferguson of the Arizona Daily Star and Michelle Marisco of our NPR sister station in Phoenix, KJZZ. Before we begin, here are the rules for tonight's discussion. Each candidate will get a 60-second opening and closing statement. In between, our panel of journalists will ask questions from a list they've prepared. The candidates have not seen the questions. The questions will be directed to one candidate who will have 1 minute to respond. Then the other candidate will have 30 seconds to rebut. If one of our journalists has a follow-up question, both candidates will have 45 seconds to respond. We'll alternate who gets each question, and we will strictly enforce the time limits. If a candidate repeatedly exceeds his allotted time, we may cede extra time to the other candidate in an effort to balance the opportunity for our audience to hear from both of them. Now for opening statements, first based on a drawing beforehand, Mr. Grijalva.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank Arizona Public Media and the journalists that are here to help facilitate this discussion. This election is important, and Arizona Public Media is giving the voters an opportunity to access and decide which candidate they can support in these very consequential midterm elections. They're consequential for a lot of reasons, but one reason that I want to point out is the deficit. By 2018, this year, the deficit is going to be $779 billion. That deficit is tied directly to the tax cuts that were given. We're 83% of the richest in the country, and the multinational corporations benefited from those tax cuts. Those are consequences that affect every American, and when a majority in Congress has an opportunity, I want to be part of that majority, to begin change some of these decisions that have been made that in the long term are going to hurt the American people.
Thank you, Mr. Grijalva. And now, Mr. Pierson, your 1 minute opening statement.
Thank you, Lorraine, and thank you, Arizona Public Media. I was born in Nogales, Arizona, and grew up on the Indian reservations. My roots run deep in the district. Living just outside a gerrymandered district does not make me care less or blind me to the fact that the district has one of the lowest K-12 educational test scores in all the 435 congressional districts. This includes graduation rates. It does not blind me to the fact that this congressional district has one of the lowest per capita incomes in the country. It does not blind me to the fact that our veterans do not receive adequate health care, or that the border is riddled with drugs and human trafficking. Nor does it blind me to the fact that in the 16 years the incumbent has no solutions to improve these conditions and raise the quality of life of its constituents. Unlike my opponent, I have no obligations to special interest groups. I would never call for a boycott of the state. I'm committed to work towards measurable change in the incomes, education rankings, veteran care, and border security. In 8 terms, 16 years, my opponent has been unable to fix, either because he is unable to or because he doesn't care about it. Politics has become a family situation, and he has profited from it, not the people.
Thank you, Mr. Pierson. Now on to the questions. District 3 includes the majority of our state's border with Mexico. So this first round will focus on issues related to border security and immigration. The first question goes to Mr. Grijalva from AZPM's Nancy Montoya.
Mr. Grijalva, there are many people across this country who feel that undocumented immigrants, especially from Mexico and Central America, are a real drain on our community resources. What's your take on that, and can you give me some examples?
Well, I think one has to put that question in the context of what has occurred for the last 18 months and even prior to that. We have had a very divisive attack on anything immigrant in this country by the president and others. We have had an enforcement-only policy by the president and others and the Department of Homeland Security. What we have at the border is very much an issue of economic failure on the part of other parts of Latin America. But more importantly, what we have at the border is an opportunity. And what we are concentrating right now is on enforcement and division. It's no secret that everybody running for office goes and takes a picture in Nogales in front of the wall and says, this is what I want to do. The issue is much more complex. It requires comprehensive approaches and solutions. It's time we talked about solutions and not just continuing to batter a dead horse about an issue that is political rhetoric and really no solutions can be offered by the majority in Congress.
Mr. Pierson, you have 30 seconds for a response.
Well, obviously, the border is a complex situation. It's going to take enforcement of the regulations that we now have, but it also involves comprehensive immigration reform. And I'm for providing a way for the people to be treated with dignity and where they can earn a path to citizenship, and I'll discuss more of that later.
Thank you. The next question is from Joe Ferguson of the Arizona Daily Star for Mr. Pierson.
Mr. Pierson, the Border Patrol reports dozens, even hundreds of migrants being arrested in Arizona's desert in the past few months. What's the federal solution to these mass migration patterns?
Would you repeat that question?
Of course. The Border Patrol reports groups of dozens, even hundreds of migrants are being arrested in Arizona's desert in the past few months. What's the federal solution to these mass migration patterns?
The solution to these mass immigration patterns is threefold. One, we have to provide border security. We have to provide comprehensive immigration reform. We have to provide a path for citizenship that includes dignity. And we're promoting our red, white, and blue plan. The red plan would be where people can announce that they are here, and then there's going to be a moratorium on the on deportations. The white plan is where Congress will agree and pass and fund an impervious wall on the Mexico and U.S. border. And three, when the wall when the barrier, not the wall, but when the barrier is complete, then the path to citizenship can be established so that everybody that is in our community can live here with dignity.
Mr. Grijalva, you have 30 seconds for a response.
The issue is an issue that cannot be easily resolved with the ball. It cannot be easily resolved with an enforcement-only attitude. This issue is an issue that deals with poverty. It deals with persecution. It deals with political upheaval in Central America in particular. And it deals with the very fundamental need of people, we saw the moms and their kids, to flee a situation and to look for an opportunity. And the United States is viewed by many in the world as that opportunity. So the fundamental issue is building capacity within the countries that are sending people and people are fleeing. Build capacity, civil society, rule of law, long term. Doing that, I think, does more to alleviate the pressure on the border in terms of people wanting to come here for all those reasons that I mentioned. Not doing anything and waiting for a wall is not going to solve the problem.
Thank you, Mr. Grijalva. I want to remind you we want to stick to our time limits here. And now question for Mr. Grijalva. This one comes from Mcsalley Marisco of our NPR sister station in Phoenix, KJZZ.
Mr. Grijalva, our ports of entry at the border are overwhelmed due to severe manpower issues, and hiring is at a standstill. And that's in spite of local government and business efforts to speed up border crossings. So what's the last legislation that you put forward or helped to support to staff our ports of entry?
Yeah, it was a piece of legislation that we've introduced every year that deals with $5 billion funding for all the ports of entry to increase personnel, modernize the facilities, and by doing that, you increase security, you expedite the flow of goods and services, you make visitation a possibility, which isn't now, and the waiting lines begin to end. That initiative was important. We were able to secure, with the help of the late Senator McCain, 500 additional Border Patrol agents for Arizona. Unfortunately, during the height of the buildup of ICE, many of those positions, 200 to 300, were taken away and reassigned to ICE in the enforcement side. There's the people in blue that work the border, customs, and the people in green, Border Patrol. And the people in blue do not have the personnel. You have 10 lanes in Mariposa, and you can only open a certain amount because you don't have the personnel. We're shortchanging that. It's good for security. It's good for economic development. And we're going to press that even harder if we have an opportunity to get our legislation heard and voted upon.
Mr. Pierson, you have 30 seconds for a response.
Well, obviously, there's a lot of problems on the border that we have to address, and the problem has to include enforcing the border and, of course, providing for a way for citizens to become legalized. And our Red, White, and Blue plan addresses that.
Now, a question from Nancy Montoya. This one is for Mr. Pierson. You have 1 minute.
Mr. Pierson, the recent separation of children from their families at the border received international attention and overwhelming condemnation by the human rights community. Do you agree with the Trump administration's policy on this and how it was handled? If you agree, tell me why. If you don't agree, tell me why.
Well, obviously, this problem involves immigration. It involves other countries. I believe that we need comprehensive immigration reform. I believe that this immigration reform should including a path for citizenship.
But the question is about the separation of children from their families at the border.
No, that's a very serious issue, and I'm sure that people have regretted that decision, and that decision, as far as I understand, has been reversed, and it's been done by other administrations. So the solution is comprehensive immigration reform, providing a way for people to proceed with dignity to a path to citizenship, and then we have a three-phase program where we can make everybody part of the community, and so they can contribute.
Mr. Grijalva, you have 30 seconds for a response.
A very sad chapter that is part of our history now, what happened at the border with the separation of children from their moms primarily. We have, and the consequences that happened afterwards in terms of their care and the issues and abuses that we saw there. Beyond that, we have 13,000 unaccompanied minors and children in detention right now under Homeland Security. 13,000. And the commentary has to be, this is not who we are. Many of these people come here seeking asylum and try to get refuge in this country. A different process from immigration, which was being denied to those people on the border.
Mr. Grijalva, I'll need to stop you,
Thank you
to keep with time. A question now from Joe Ferguson. This one goes to Mr. Grijalva.
Mr. Grijalva, increased staffing and infrastructure over the last 15 years has led to a significant drop in smuggling and human smuggling in the Yuma sector. What is the next step for District 3?
I think all along the border, all our ports of entry, 63+% of all the seizures, the unauthorized seizures, whether it's people or drugs or whatever, occur at the port of entry. I would think, I'm not an expert, but that would be a point of concentration with resources. I'd like to see that the attention that is occurring now and staffing up and modernizing the ports of entry, whether it's Douglas, whether it is Nogales, whether it's Sasabe and San Luis, along the U.S.-Arizona border and with Mexico, those areas I think are essential for what I said earlier, the flow of goods and service and economic development, but also for security purposes. And I think that's where the concentration has to be, and not continuing this path that ICE is on and that Homeland Security is on, of making this more about interior enforcement, when the reality is that the ports of entry provide us with an opportunity that's not being taken.
And Mr. Pierson, you have 30 seconds for a response.
We cannot have immigration reform without a secure border. A secure border means that we're going to stem the flow of drugs and human trafficking. And this requires a comprehensive program of immigration reform.
The next question is from Michelle Marisco. This one is for Mr. Pierson. 1 minute response, please.
Mr. Pierson, I'm going to go back in history a bit. Many predecessors here in our congressional districts have tried comprehensive immigration reform. What would you propose as far as some sort of legislation for immigration that actually has an opportunity to pass, and that's also bipartisan?
Well, part of the problem has been that the sides have been very divided on this, and the sides have been extreme in the initial approach. So we propose a comprehensive immigration reform, which involves acknowledging that people are here that are undocumented. We're going to provide that those people that are here undocumented and that are not criminals be given a 2-year probation. as far as any deportation. The second part of the plan would include, which is the white part, the part of the plan would include Congress passing and funding a bill to create an impervious barrier at the border. And the third part of the plan would be, once that barrier is complete, that the path to citizenship would be completed, and we could have all of the people that are here contributing to our economy and be able to live here with dignity, and then they would eventually become citizens, those that wanted to. So this has to be done first, but we have to do it with a secure border.
Mr. Grijalva, you have 30 seconds for a response.
Immigration reform, comprehensive immigration reform, as outlined by my opponent, it has been a piece of legislation that since I've been there, has been introduced and reintroduced every year. And it carries all those 3 points: security, process, and path to legalization. But, you know, we saw a good example. DACA, a compromise, bipartisan agreement where we all gave in, never brought up to a vote. And that was just one part of comprehensive reform. The difficulty is the politicalization of immigration reform in this country, and the reluctance of a president to ever sign anything that even remotely approaches that. That's why Congress has to do the hard work.
Stop you there. All right, the next question is from Nancy Montoya. This one goes to you, Mr. Grijalva. Again, 1 minute response, please.
Mr. Grijalva, you know, when we talk about the Arizona border, we usually talk about the Nogales ports of entry, but I'm interested also in San Luis. Have you spent any time on both sides of the border, and have you had a chance to talk with the people about what they believe the U.S. federal government needs to give them?
Next week, there's going to be an opening of a pedestrian lane that is going to expedite crossings. It's something that everybody has been working for a long time. San Luis is in need of economic development as well. It has the ability to expand in certain areas, and we need to follow that up. I think it's a port that has a great deal of potential. There was a huge expansion done under the Stimulus Act with Obama, but it's yet to be staffed in order to provide that commercial traffic and security to happen there. Yeah, both sides of the border. And Mexico has to cooperate by creating the transportation avenues that would get to that port of entry that don't exist at this point in San Luis right now.
Mr. Pierson, you have 30 seconds for a response.
Well, I've been at San Luis and attended the bilateral border commission meetings, and what's missing is a leader that will go in and bring the government side together, both the Mexican government on the federal side and the state side, and both the local governments on the port of entries and the federal government. So it takes leadership to accomplish this. Obviously, it hasn't been done to the degree that it needs to be in the past.
This last border question, it comes from Joe Ferguson. This one is for Mr. Pierson. Joe.
Mr. Pierson, this is one of 9 districts in the country that border Mexico. What doesn't Washington fail to understand about life and economics here?
Well, life and economics on the district are very important. What we need to have is someone who's going to work hard to improve the economic and living conditions in the district. It saddens me when I go to Nogales. It saddens me when I see parts of San Luis. It saddens me when I'm in parts of the South Tucson and the west side, and to see the state of the economic and living conditions in the district. So I don't think a lot of people across the country understand that, and that's something that we need to do. It takes leadership. It takes working with a business and government and the local institutions to improve the opportunities for our citizens to improve their wages.
Mr. Grijalva, you have 30 seconds for a response.
There's a stereotype about the borderlands, and it is prevalent in Washington, among Congress and the leadership in Congress right now, that this is a political issue. And so people, culture, diversity, potential, and opportunity are not part of the equation. This is political fodder in D.C. They come, take a picture, leave, and never stop to understand both the history and the importance of this border region.
Thank you, Mr. Grijalva. We have a follow-up question now. This one comes from Michelle Marisco. Michelle, please indicate which candidate you'd like to answer first. And as a reminder, both candidates will have 45 seconds to answer this question.
Mr. Grijalva, of all of your legislation that you have supported and tried to put forth on the border. What are you most proud of, and what has been your biggest accomplishment?
I thought the legislative efforts haven't been accepted as legislative efforts. And when I began this process, very few supported it. That momentum has changed considerably in the last 4 years, and we have some opportunities. The successes are convincing the previous administration about the need for stimulus packages in Mariposa, San Luis, so that we could start to build up that infrastructure. The corridor going from Nogales to Tucson that now received $25 million, very proud of that. And so it has been a consequence of having someone in the White House that was appreciative of that and supported the local communities. Legislatively, it's got to be comprehensive reform, and so far there hasn't been an appetite by these majorities in Congress to even tackle that.
All right, I need to stop you there. Mr. Pierson, you have 45 seconds to respond.
As far as the question that Mr. Marisco just had?
Yes, sir, please.
Well, one thing that the incumbent has failed to tell us is that he had very little to do with that money going to the border communities. The other legislators worked very hard at that, and he's all happy to be in on the goodies on that. So it's an important area. It takes leadership, and it takes someone, as he mentioned, that can get the agreement of the others in Congress. And I believe he's not in a position, because of his views, where he's going to be able to accomplish that, and that's why we need change.
That concludes our segment on border-related questions. We now turn our attention to issues related to the environment. The first question is from AZPM's Nancy Montoya. This one is for Mr. Grijalva. Reminder, 1 minute response, please.
Vamos a hablar un poquito de agua. And I know both of you are bilingual, so you know that means water. Mr. Grijalva, about the Colorado River watershed situation, what should be the federal government's role in having some kind of a drought contingency plan? What should the federal government's role be in that? I
think federal government's role with regard to the Colorado River has to be proactive. And right now, just kind of sitting back under this administration and seeing what the state of Arizona and their own stumbling around on what to do with a water management plan for the state, given droughts, given scarcity, given the finite reality of that resource, the federal government needs to step in and provide guidance. The Colorado is a resource for 17 million people, countless businesses from here to Southern California and beyond. And so it is a resource that needs to be preserved. We cannot allow uranium mining around the Grand Canyon to preserve that water source, and we cannot let the subsistence to continue to happen without having contingency plans. And this requires choices, and this requires users to understand that sometimes the highest users and consumers of water in this state have to take a back step toward the reality that we have now, that we have to conserve this water and manage it much better than we're doing now.
Thank you. Mr. Pierson, you have 30 seconds for a response.
Well, the water issue is a state issue that needs to be resolved between the participating states in the Central Arizona Project. I would prefer that the federal government not be involved. And as far as the local sources of water, currently the city of Tucson is on CAP water, and my biggest concern is the contamination level. So I think one of the biggest things we can do is forward legislation that would create a national standard for the water quality. And this is one thing that is missing, and we need scientific help on this.
Thank you. Now a question from Joe Ferguson from the Arizona Daily Star. This one is for Mr. Pierson.
Mr. Pierson, how will you work in Congress to prioritize what is often seen as Western issues, such as federal versus private land use?
Well, private land use should first be taken up by the state. One of the things that I would be in favor of is that the federal lands, more of those federal lands be turned over to the state, so that this could increase the educational trust fund and increase revenues from the state trust funds. And with so much of the federal lands and the state being controlled by federal and tribal entities, that doesn't leave as much for the state trust lands. And I think we should also swap out land that should be in the state trust land. Some of our state trust land is in the Yuma Proving Ground, so we should swap land out so that land that we can't use right now that's in the Human Proving Grounds be part of the state trust land. So creative things like that should be done that would increase the revenue to fund our schools.
Mr. Grijalva, you have 30 seconds for a response.
The public lands in Arizona and along the Southwest are essential, and the oversight by the federal government is essential. Right now, this administration has made the public lands a one-dimensional resource, extraction, oil, gas, mining, period. And that's our public lands and our waterways as well, like the Colorado, are a national resource. And I think that the perspective the federal government could bring to this is that we need to protect those. They need to be conserved where they need to be conserved. And more importantly, as we look at climate change and that reality, and as we look at what's going on with water in that reality, those public lands become invaluable in terms of how they fit into that picture.
And a reminder, we'll stick to the time limits. Any overages will result in a penalty later. Next to Mr. Grijalva, this one is from Michelle Marisco from our NPR sister station in Phoenix, KJZZ. Michelle.
Mr. Grijalva, two questions. First, do you favor Arizona implementing strict water conservation throughout the state? And secondly, in a follow-up, how would you work with the Arizona governor to balance out our water needs with our growth?
Yeah, the domestic use, the household use of water in this state has increased exponentially as we have grown in population. And that has to be accommodated. And the issue of the use of water by mining companies has to be accommodated, has to be looked at in terms of how much they use, how much certain crops use in terms of how the high use of water they have. That has to be all factored in. And the governor and other elected officials must begin to look at those options and those hard choices that they're facing. I think to ignore the fact that this finite resource is going down is a mistake. Another thing I would do is this assured water permit that is given to developers, like along the San Pedro that the court just ruled for. Assured water seems to has no criteria to it. Assured water should really mean that scientifically. Assured water. And I think many times they're handed out as part of a development agreement when in reality it's more water we're losing.
Thank you. Mr. Pierson, you have 30 seconds for a response.
Well, we're going to be fighting all over the world for water, and in Arizona, we really need to address that. So one of my biggest concerns is local, and that local concerns involves our water table, which at the moment has too many contaminants, and this problem needs to be addressed because if there is a drought situation, Tucson is going to be one of the first ones to be suffering from this. And obviously, we need the cooperation of the Central Arizona Project to the extent that we can. I don't want the federal government involved, only as a last resort.
Thank you. The next question comes from Nancy Montoya. This one is for Mr. Pierson.
Mr. Pierson, should environmental policies, especially things like carbon emission standards, should that be a federal, a state, or a local issue? Pick your poison and tell me why.
Well, obviously, climate change is a very critical issue. We have to be leaders in protecting the environment. Our country should be leading in innovation in ways to protect the environment and clean the environment. And as far as the carbon tax is concerned, that has to be part of the total package which addresses climate change. Taking money from different areas for this has to be considered very carefully because we have to consider the effects on our economy. So we have to address this in a way that's fiscally responsible.
Mr. Grijalva, you have 30 seconds for a response.
The United States has become re-engaged in the issue of climate change. It is a worldwide issue. It affects this country. We're the greatest producer of the greenhouse effect in the world, and we need to be involved. That we shouldn't pull out of the Paris Accord. We should use fact and science to drive the policies of the agencies like EPA and Interior, which has now been dismantled as a function of those agencies. So fact and science, and I think those will lead us in the right direction. Right now, that's not part of the equation with this administration, and pulling out of the Paris Accords is a huge mistake.
Thank you, Mr. Grijalva. A reminder, we need to stick to the time frame. Joe Ferguson, we have a follow-up question from you, also related to the environment. Each candidate will have 45 seconds to answer. Joe.
Mr. Pierson, I'd like to start with you. The Secretary of Interior has closely scrutinized Western national monuments and scaled back the square mileage in at least one. Do you support that move? And please explain why, if so.
Well, obviously, that's involves the economies of that district, and the federal government control of a lot of the public lands. They control so much, especially here in Arizona. So, in terms of that particular monument or any of the other monuments, perhaps some of them are the right size, perhaps some of them are not. So that is a question that I don't have the right answer for you on.
Mr. Grijalva, you have 45 seconds to respond.
Thank you. What Secretary Zinke did in Shrinking Bear's Ears, Escalante Staircase, and others, and other monuments was not just a mistake. It went against a precedent that had been established, and that's being litigated right now as we speak. But he has refused to disclose who he met with. He has refused how the decision was made. And people that were involved in that issue and the majority of the American people that supported maintaining the monuments have not been part of the equation. This is, again, goes back to a focus on extraction and forgetting the importance of particularly Bear's Ears and those monuments that have existed for a long, long time.
Thank you, gentlemen. We're about halfway through this debate. We now turn our attention to local issues of importance to the constituents of District 3. The first question is from Michelle Marisco. This one is for Mr. Grijalva.
You've been active for years on national stage politics, from the Affordable Health Care Act to the Keystone Pipeline. But even on your own campaign page, I don't see a lot of activity taken for people right here in CD3. So if you're reelected, what specifically will you do for your specific constituents locally?
Well, I think the issue that I have spoken about and the issues that I speak about nationally and here locally as well, having to do with the environment, having to do with clean air, clean water, having to do with education and the needing to strengthen public education instead of dismantling, those issues resonate because I believe that education and the bottom line is the short-term, long-term solution to economic development and to the issues that challenge the district. So I will continue to work on those, and we are involved in those issues and many, many more. The national focus is a necessary national focus because I think that by us creating the echo chamber that we have, it heightens those issues. And like I said, those issues are vital, they're necessary, and we continue to promote it. Our work in the local community and in the district is something we do on a daily basis and take it as part of the job, as an important part of the job. But my voice at a national level, when needed, it's lent.
Mr. Pierson, you have 30 seconds for a response.
Ooh, that gave me a headache. As I said, you don't have to live in the district to see the problems in the district. The highest unemployment rate in the state, lowest per capita income, lowest graduation rates. For someone that brags that the only reason to vote for him is that he lives in the district, he certainly hasn't spent much time understanding the needs in the district. My constituents have told me that if you follow the money, you know who he represents. 90% of his money comes from outside the district. Very little comes from Tucson. He gets his money from New York City, man, and Washington, D.C.
Mr. Grijalva, a follow-up question, a point of clarification. Would you provide one example of what you've done on the federal level to improve education in Congressional District 3?
Expanding Head Start for migrant workers, initiatives to create money and opportunities in legislation for preschool and universal preschool that districts could access in the district, and defending and promoting the idea of adult basic education and retraining for adults. Those have all been specific issues that I've worked on and have been successful at.
Thank you. Move on now to a question from Nancy Montoya. This one is for Mr. Pierson.
Mr. Pierson, about your constituents in CD3, can you tell me specifically, and I mean specifically, what kind of legislation would you push for that would help those people in CD3?
Well, one of the things that I would strive to do is to increase the federal funding for our K through 12 education. Education in the K through 12 system has been cut dramatically, and you don't have a lot of the programs that I benefited from when I went to the schools on the reservations. This needs to be addressed. In addition, to improve education, we need to work with the private sector and the educational and the government sector to be able to find ways to improve education. It's not going to be all about money. It's going to be about making efficient use of resources, reducing expenses, and making sure that the money is spent adequately, making sure that we have competent teachers in the classroom. All of these things can be used to improve the educational system in the schools, and also improving vocational training both in high school and after high school. Programs such as this have been missing in many of the schools in the district.
Mr. Grijalva, you now have 30 seconds for a response.
Yeah, that's wonderful thoughts. The problem is that you have a state like Arizona that per capita doesn't fund its education, one of the lowest in the country. You have now an administration that continues to cut public education and move more and more toward privatization of our public schools. There is no investment in our public education system. There is no investment in the educators in the classroom. It is about resources. It is about maintaining a level of funding and supplemental support from the federal government that's going to educate these kids. To say that it could be done just by willpower is a huge mistake.
The next question is for Mr. Grijalva. This one comes from Joe Ferguson. A reminder, 1-minute response, please.
Mr. Grijalva, agriculture is a driving economic force in the district. Are small farmers and large corporations equally supported by existing federal policies?
No, they're not. The farm bill that used to be bipartisan, that's part of the debate. That is more corporate farming than it is sustaining, incentivizing, and protecting small farmers and family-owned farms in this country. And I think that part of the issue is that we need to encourage organic farming. We need to encourage families and to help retain their farmland, but it's corporate. And right now the policies are directed in the direction of their benefit, as opposed to seeing what we can do by increasing not only the number of small farmers, but how to sustain them at that level.
Thank you. Mr. Pierson, you have 30 seconds for a response.
Well, obviously, agriculture is an important part of the economy in all of the counties in our district. Agriculture is a multi-billion-dollar industry in the district, and many of the farms are incorporated because of our tax structure. There's tax advantages when you incorporate. So you have small family businesses that incorporate because it assists them with their tax structure. So this is something that goes on every day all across the nation.
This next question is from Mcsalley for Mr. Pierson.
How will you balance the urban and rural needs in this district? And that includes Metro Tucson, Southern Phoenix suburbs, plus vast stretches of sparsely populated towns. How would you balance these all out?
Well, the needs of the district are similar in that all of the areas in the district require access to jobs. They require access to quality education. So these opportunities that exist in the district are not unique to an urban area as opposed to a rural area. So we need to provide resources in both the urban and rural areas that are going to be beneficial for our youth, provide job opportunities, increase opportunities for them to do better in life and to improve their standard of living and economic and living conditions. This really needs to be done on the reservations. It needs to be done in all the small communities. And this takes cooperation between the business sector, the private sector, government, and educational institutions. So it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of cooperation in order to do this.
Thank you. Mr. Grijalva, you have 30 seconds.
Yeah, create a balance. And I think with 70% of the population is in the urban areas in this district, Yuma and Tucson primarily. But that's only 30% of the landmass. 70% of the district is rural, in smaller communities and rural areas. And what's needed there is not just the issue of access, it's the issue of infrastructure, and it's the issue of retention, healthcare, transportation, basic services, broadband, even getting to those communities. And so if you're going to deal with rural America, it's not just a question of waiting for Santa Claus. I think there has to be initiatives on the part of the federal government to provide.
Thank you, Mr. Grijalva. We'll have to stop you there. We do have a follow-up question also related to the environment. This one comes from, or issues related to Congressional District 3. This one comes from Nancy Montoya.
For Mr. Pierson.
Yes, ma'am.
One of the political realities is that an elected official at the federal level is only as powerful as the committees you get placed on. If you are elected, what specific committees would you seek to be appointed to in order to help this district?
Well, first of all, in helping this district, I can help the district most from working from the local level. I will work hard to be on other committees in Congress. I understand that you have to buy yourself a position on a lot of those committees, but I will work locally first.
What do you mean by yourself?
Well, I've understood that some of the positions you have to contribute money to your to the leadership to get a position. So I'm going to start locally and improve the economy and the living conditions in the district as best I can, and I'm going to do the best I can to improve and gain access to committees in Congress.
What committees?
Well, the Education Committee is an important one. We need to get more funding for here, and also the the immigration to protect the border and to improve the border security and to work on the immigration reform.
Thank you, Mr. Grijalva. You have 45 seconds to respond.
If re-elected, I'll retain the two committees I have. And that if I'm fortunate enough to be in the majority, I will be chairman of the National Resources Committee and the second most senior member of the Education and Workforce Committee. So that some of the things and legislation, concepts that present majorities for the last 8 years are not allowed even to be heard at our committee hearings will now have an opportunity to be debated and go through regular order. If I have that opportunity and I'm reelected, I would stay on the committees that I'm on.
Thank you. Now, for the remainder of tonight's debate, our panel will be asking questions covering a variety of issues facing the district and the nation. Joe Ferguson of the Arizona Daily Star. A question now for Mr. Grijalva.
Mr. Grijalva, I'm glad you mentioned regular order. Congress hasn't passed a full-year budget in a very long time. Instead, it passes a bunch of short-term temporary measures known as continuing resolutions. These give federal agencies little room to plan to make changes, but gives Congress and the president a tool for negotiating policy. Would you advocate for or against this pattern of budgeting?
Against. I think one of the things that the House of Representatives has to, as a co-equal member of Congress and an important responsibility for the United States Congress, House of Representatives, is to develop the budget. And to develop the budget through each committee process, to have hearings, to look at each agency, and then from that budget is adopted, then you go through the appropriations process of how you are going to spend that money. We haven't done that. It's been piecemeal of that. We're working under a continuing resolution till December 7th right now. And nobody can plan. We don't have an infrastructure bill. We don't have a transportation bill. We don't have a farm bill. And I think that the American people deserve a much better. They deserve some consistency and some ability to know what that decision is going to impact on them for that year and following years. And we're not doing that.
Mr. Pierson, you now have 30 seconds for a response.
Well, obviously, we all would like a balanced budget at the federal level. The problems are many in designing a budget. What needs to be done is you need to get agreement among both parties that we're going to be at a certain spending level and to take into consideration unfunded liabilities. Those are going to be hitting us. We have future liabilities in terms of health care for our elderly. And so it's a difficult situation, but we need to work hard on that.
A question now from KJZZ's Michelle Marisco. This question is for Mr. Pierson.
Our border towns in CD3, they're hurting economically. Prominent businesses have shuttered. Main streets are drying up in Nogales and Douglas and San Luis. So what do you propose to support these local areas as they attempt to bring some sort of economic stability or business back to those main streets?
Well, that's a very important problem that we have all along the border and the border cities. What we need to do, and what I have spent my life doing, is working with small to medium-sized businesses and working within the community organizations, the nonprofit boards that I've worked on, to creating a consensus on solutions to the problem. So one of the things that we need to do is work with the public sector, the private sector, and the educational institutions in the community so that we can find ways to solve the problems in terms of growing the economy. And you need to create an environment that will provide for businesses to grow. I will put a lot of energies into promoting business growth throughout the district, and we need to create more educational opportunities. This involves training our students with vocational training so that they can advance in their careers, and we can attract more employers that provide better salaries.
Mr. Grijalva, you have 30 seconds for
Thank
response.
you. The border bill that I referenced earlier had a major component of economic development. And I think that it's a good time to talk about investment, because part of this whole discussion is magically it'll happen. No. The role the federal government has in areas like the border that you pointed out, those needs, is to invest in it, to incentivize, to fix those ports of entry, to work in order to lift and diversify that economy along that border. It's an investment strategy. And by having an investment strategy, then you begin to develop the economic development activity that needs to happen on the border. Without an investment by the federal government, which has occurred for the last decade, we continue to sit around twiddling our thumbs and hoping something will happen. There has to be an initiative.
And now a question from Arizona Public Media's Nancy Montoya. This question is for Mr. Grijalva. Again, a 1-minute response, 30-second rebuttal from Mr. Pierson.
Mr. Grijalva, you've been arrested for protesting some federal policies, and you often speak harshly about the president and about the Republican Party. How does that serve your district?
Well, I think it serves it in the sense that, you know, I said it before, I wasn't elected to Congress to be a potted plant. I have a voice, and I think that voice is representative of the majority of the district, and I use that voice. And to point out what Trump is doing in a variety of arenas is, I think, my responsibility. To question and to be an effective opposition to some of the initiatives that the Republican majorities are doing in Congress and the things they're not doing, I think that's my responsibility as well. Because if we are going to talk about change in the future, then I think people need to know where you're coming from, what your position is, and not hide from it. And I think people that know me know that I don't have a problem telling people what my position is, and I don't have a problem opposing things that I think are hurtful to the district and will aggravate a situation even more worse than it is right now.
Mr. Grijalva, a point of clarification on that. Do you believe that breaking the law, getting arrested, is the proper representation, leadership to show young people in your district?
Well, it's an issue of civil disobedience, and it's an issue that is protected by the First Amendment. I think I'm being consistent. You know, people can lie and throw things at me, but, you know, I believe in the First Amendment, so that right to lie is protected. But I feel that when it comes to a situation to bring issue to DACA in front of Trump Tower in New York City, and to make that an issue and draw national attention to it, was an appropriate move in order to do just that.
Thank you. Mr. Pierson, you have 30 seconds for a response, please.
Well, to that point, being effective means getting your views accepted enough so that the majority moves the ball forward. Mr. Grijalva clearly has not been effective. He's had 16 years to be effective in Congress, and he's ineffective in moving the ball forward. So what we need to do is change. The district needs change.
Thank you, Mr. Pierson. Now a question from Joe Ferguson. This is for Mr. Pierson.
Mr. Pierson, you've made personal attacks during this campaign. Is that emblematic of how you will treat Democrats in Congress if you're elected?
This isn't about ethnicity. It's about doing your job. It's about the values that we all hold in the district. It's about respect for women. It's about respect for our neighbors. It's about holding yourself up as a role model that the people in the district can be proud of. It doesn't have anything to do with ethnicity.
Mr. Grijalva, you have 30 seconds for a response.
Yeah, in terms of the issue of leadership, the majority of the American people support and believe in climate change and want the federal government to do something about it. Yet, the majorities in Congress do nothing. The majority of the American people want something done for DACA, codified and protected permanently. Congress does nothing. The majority of the American people believe in immigration reform and a path to citizenship. Congress does nothing. The majority of American people think the tax cuts favored the wealthy and wealthy corporations and didn't affect them. And yet, we double down and do another tax cut. So my point is that leadership is about reflecting what the majority of the people want, and I think I do that.
I need to stop you there. The next question comes from Michelle Marisco. This one is for you, Mr. Grijalva.
Sure.
Mr. Grijalva, your critics say that diplomacy isn't exactly one of your strengths. But more than that, there's a deep-seated concern in the Democratic Party that you burn bridges, and that makes it difficult to find common ground. So if you're reelected, you'll be among the most senior representatives. How will you comport yourself?
I'll comport myself the way I have, professionally, doing my job, initiating legislation, being a co-leader of the Progressive Caucus of 77 other members of Congress, being elected to be the ranking member and soon the chairman of the Resources Committee. I don't think those come by merely me not being reflective of what I think my members on the Democratic side are. And I've worked with colleagues across the aisle on good pieces of legislation that just haven't been heard. But my point I'm making is that Congress is a place in which you earn the respect of your colleagues. And I've earned that, and I'm very comfortable with the role I have, and I'm very comfortable with the leadership that I play there.
Mr. Pierson, you have 30 seconds to respond.
Well, a leader certainly wouldn't be settling a $48,000 lawsuit using taxpayer money or showing up to work drunk on the job. The office requires a respect for the office and providing a proper role model for young people in the district. And this culture also means that elected officials should be respected regardless of who they are.
Mr. Grijalva, I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond to that.
No, I've responded many times. Responded that we asked for an ethics. The recommendation was dismissal. There was never any issue of sexual impropriety, abuse, or harassment. The issue was a settlement on a termination. The settlement came down to $48,000, and it was done. But to say that that I'm showing up drunk to work, I would challenge. There's 200 employees I've worked with since I've been in Congress. There's numerous organizations and individuals in this community that I've worked with. And like I said earlier, when one is devoid of substance and capacity in dealing with the issues that we confront in this country and in this district, then the only place to go is to do what Trump has normalized, to attack the individual and not deal with the ideas and the debate and the dialogue that's necessary on the issues.
The next question comes from Nancy Montoya. This one is for Mr. Pierson, and in the interest of time, I'd like to keep the responses to 45 seconds, please. Nancy.
Mr. Pierson, you seem to intimate that personal character is important, and you have claimed in the past something to the effect that Mr. Grijalva is not Mexican enough. Isn't that a personal attack and shows a lack of character on your part to ask that question?
This has nothing to do with ethnicity. It has to do with values, the values that people in the district hold, where a person can be held up as a role model for the citizens in the community. It doesn't reflect ethnicity at all. It just reflects the values that we all hold dear, that have been passed down to us from our grandfathers, the culture that we've inherited regardless of our ethnicity. So this is really the crux of the matter. We want somebody in Congress that we can be proud of.
Sir, what would be Mexican enough?
This isn't about Mexican. This isn't about ethnicity.
But you said he was not Mexican enough. Isn't that ethnicity?
That is not what I said. I said he's not a good role model for any ethnicity. That's what I said. So you're taking my words out of context.
I'd like to give Congressman Grijalva a moment to respond to this. 30 seconds, please.
There's not much response, you know. As human beings, we all have, we're not infallible. We make mistakes. And, but I've had the good fortune of being raised in a community from a family that feels that hard work and effort pays off. And I've been a beneficiary of that. And, you know, the diversity of a community, our Latino community is not monolithic. We have differences of opinion. We have different philosophies. And the fact that I might have a different philosophy from my opponent doesn't make me a bad person. It's just the difference. And the substance of that difference is what voters get to vote on. But to make this an issue about putting oneself in a glass house and being the moral equivalent of the best at the expense of another person, that's not my style. My opponent can continue to do that, but that's not my style.
Thank you. We'll end it there. That's all the time we have for questions. Each of you will now have 1 minute for a closing statement. First, Mr. Grijalva.
Thank you. You know, this election is consequential. I said it at the beginning. It is time that we have a majority in the House of Representatives, a Democratic majority, that'll check and balance Trump and this administration, that will prepare a budget, that will advocate for change, that will do regular order, but more importantly, to deal with the very important issue of being a co-equal branch of government. So when it comes to the environment, when it comes to education, when it comes to budget, when it comes to opportunity, that you have a majority that is acting like a majority, that holds this administration accountable, that demands oversight, and that behaves like a Congress. That's the consequence. To return the same majority and to enhance the majority is to continue to allow an administration to have its worst excesses and instincts play out in front of the American people.
Thank you, Mr. Grijalva. Now, Mr. Pierson, you have 1 minute for a closing statement.
Thank you. We've covered a lot this evening, and I'm so thankful for the opportunity to show that I care about the prosperity of our district and our country. Unlike my opponent, I'm not a career politician. I've been in business for many years, and I'm at the point in my life where I'm able to give back where I see a need. Congressional District 3 and our country have many needs. As we saw tonight, problems have plagued the district throughout Raul's entire 16-year incumbency. In business, when someone is not meeting the job requirements, it's time for a change. Time to give someone with the fresh ideas and proven experience the chance to make a difference. I have no skeletons in my closet and can assure you I'll never embarrass you with my behavior or ethics. I've not needed to pay $48,000 of taxpayer money to settle lawsuits. My legacy will not be a career politician that has established a patronage system within the district. I will not serve the special interest as my opponent. That pay to play. I will serve you. We need better. We deserve better. Vote for me, Nick Pierson. I won't let you down. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you for sticking to the parameters of tonight's debate. That brings us to the end of the Your Vote 2018 Congressional District 3 debate. Thank you to our panel of journalists, including our very own Nancy Montoya, our partners in tonight's debate, Joe Ferguson of the Arizona Daily Star, and Mcsalley Marisco of our sister station in Phoenix, KJZZ. And to the candidates, of course, Mr. Pierson and Mr. Grijalva. Thank you so much for being here this evening.
Thank you.
And of course, to you, our viewers and listeners, be sure to tune in to PBS 6 Plus immediately following this broadcast to watch the U.S. Senate debate between Democrat Kyrsten Sinema and Republican Martha Mcsalley. They're running for the seat left open by retiring Republican Jeff Flake. They debated in Phoenix on Monday night. That's on PBS 6 Plus, which can be found on 6.3 or 27.3 over the air on Cox Channel 82 and Comcast Channel 396. That's tonight, beginning at 8 o'clock. Also, do not forget to vote on Tuesday, November 6th. For all of us at Arizona Public Media, I'm Lorraine Rivera. Thank you for joining us.